Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which is just to take my brain out of the mode of background work over the course of the week and move into the process of actually writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason for doing these. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer who have come across this video for whatever reason has brought you here today, to gain some different insight into the assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is September 3rd, 2017, the 13th Sunday after Pentecost, also Labor Day weekend. So happy Labor Day holiday weekend to all of you people here in the U.S. Our gospel lesson comes out of Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. Now, this is a continuation of the story, direct continuation from last week, if you happen to catch that video. It's more of the exact same story. Some scholars like the split that the lectionary gives us between verse 20 and verses 21, thinking that it's sort of really two different events. Some don't. I fall in the latter category because with what is going on here Jesus rebuking Peter after Peter rebukes Jesus and calling him a stumbling block and all that stuff. I can't hear that without having just heard Peter's confession of Jesus as the Messiah. And I talked a lot about that last week. So some of this may sound kind of similar because it's as I said, it's very, very similar. And at least in my head, this is all one big story. So that's kind of where we're at. So if you did happen to catch that video, that's kind of what's been happening, that Jesus is in a momentary lull in the ministry, and he asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they respond, well, some say that you're John the Baptist, some say Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Then he says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter says that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And with that, Jesus kind of rejoices and says, that flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven, reminding us that faith is not of us, it's not self-generated, that it's a gift of God. And he says, and then there's the name change. He says, your name is Simon, son of Jonah, but now I will call you Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So that's just happened. And then we see a shift, and we see Jesus begin to explain, this is what the Messiah means. Now, when I was talking last week, I mentioned quite a bit of what the first century Jewish understanding of the Messiah would be. I feel the need to kind of touch base with that just a little bit again. I've heard some things, or I've read some things this week that maybe shed a little bit of sidelight. I don't know if that's the way to say it, but maybe kind of contradict what I said just a little bit. That even by the first century, there was a lot of different Jewish understanding about what the Messiah would be, or who the Messiah would be, or what the Messiah would accomplish. So to simply say that everyone in the Jewish culture would have expected a political leader in the realm of like David or Solomon that had come 900 or 1,000 years before Jesus is maybe not the most accurate thing. So I just felt the need to kind of dispel that, if you happen to catch that from last week. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some Jewish people who that was their thought. Certainly Peter might fall in that category. We don't know. Being, he wasn't, he would not have been educated as a simple laborer or as a fisherman. So it's possible that he did fall in that category, but again, just to specify, not everyone did. So I just felt the need to bring that up. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into this. Again, I'm picking up at verse 21. I may do a little bit of overlap. Last week in my sermon, I did do some overlap. So these first few verses, I also included. I may back up some and include some of that, or I may just reference it because I just think it's important. But Matthew 16, 21 through 28. From that time on, after Peter confessed Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. Side note, that God forbid it, the Greek in there is actually like, God have mercy on you, or mercy to you, or mercy from God to you, Lord. This must never happen. More like, instead of saying God won't allow that, it's more like may this not happen to you, or may you be spared from this. That's kind of the implication of what Peter's saying there. But he, Jesus, turned to and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block for me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, but those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming into his kingdom." All right, so that's the end of it. One quick note about that ending thing. Oftentimes it's thought, well, is Jesus telling his disciples that some of them standing there aren't going to die before he returns? We don't know exactly what to make of that, but this is a common thread as to what Paul faced in his first letter to the Thessalonians. The church at Thessalonica had, enough time had gone by that some of their people were beginning to die. And so the thought that the Messiah, that Jesus is coming back very soon, kind of is starting to be questioned. It's like, well, what do we make of this if some of our people are dying? And some kind of put this in the same vein. That, well, is this kind of what Jesus is talking about there? Is this what he's saying? And interestingly enough, one of the things that I'm thinking about, and this is just an idea. I don't know if this is what Jesus is referring to or not, but immediately following this, when we pick up in chapter 17, is the story of the Transfiguration, when Jesus climbs the mountain and he's transfigured, and we see this instant when the divine is shining through the human. And some of them are there. Peter, James, and John are there. So is that what he's talking about? That some of you will not taste death until you see the glory of God in me? Maybe, I don't know, but that's an idea. That's just something I want to bring up. So there's some different things going on here. We continue to see as I said last week, just the movement of Peter, or I don't know if movement's the right word. We see the revealing of his lack of understanding. Maybe that's a way of saying it. I mean, he's just been called the Rock, and now, like half a second later, Jesus reduces him down, or chips him down, or crumbles him down to a stumbling block. So this rock, which was going to be maybe not the foundation or maybe not the cornerstone, but the rock on which the church will be built, is now all of a sudden causing stumbling. What is this stumbling? What is Jesus referring to here? Now, when I hear "Get behind me, Satan," this is very reminiscent of the end of the 40 days of temptation that we see right after Jesus' baptism, when Satan when the devil is tempting him in different ways, and he ends that by saying, "Away with you, Satan." So the wording's just a little bit different, but it's kind of the same thing. It seems to be a command of get out of my way. Jesus is turning his face towards Jerusalem, where we're at in the narrative. We really begin to see that, and we'll hear more predictions of his passion to come. There's a few more times. This is the first one, but Jesus knows what's coming. He knows that things are coming to a head, and that his time is coming near, and that it's going to be violent, it's going to be bloody, it's going to be torturous, and he's revealing that to them. Now, is Peter saying that is Peter revealing that he doesn't believe that that's the truth, that that's what needs to happen? Maybe. Is he more upset that his friend, his rabbi, the man that he loves, is going to suffer, and he doesn't want that, he doesn't hope for that? And there's no real way to answer that question. We don't know exactly what Peter's thinking here, but yet he's clearly disturbed by it. And I think at times we would be disturbed by that. We've got hindsight. We've got 2,000 years worth of knowing this story, the history of that behind us. So we know that the cross is past tense, and we know that Easter happens. We know that the resurrection happens. So we have that benefit of hindsight. Peter would not have had that. And even though Jesus can talk about it, it's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to actually witness that it has happened, or that it has already happened, past tense. And that's not where Peter's at. So if we think about the Messiah, if we think about God's chosen one, however that's going to look for those who were there, whether it's from a political standpoint or a military standpoint, or whether it's a spiritual thing, regardless, it's all future tense. So for God's chosen one to be killed, and to hear about that, of course, that would be shocking. That would be difficult to comprehend. It's a paradox that God is accomplishing work, and the work that Jesus talks about continuously is going to happen through death, or that it will come to a close with death. Well, we know it doesn't come to a close, but they didn't. And so is that maybe what's going on here? Is that some of the confusion? And I find myself wondering, and I don't necessarily have a good answer for this, but what would be an equivalent of that today? If some great leader that we're looking towards, the leader of some movement, whether it's political or whatever, the leader of some movement is essentially telling us that it's going to end in death and violence at the hands of the earthly powers. I don't have an answer to that, but it's something that I'm thinking about. It's a question that I kind of want to pose in my sermon for the people to think about. But again, that paradox. All in all, it comes around to this idea that what should not happen does. What doesn't make sense happens anyway, because God is acting in a way that's a paradox. Jesus himself is a paradox. The Christ event is a paradox. And as Jesus says, those we hear it, and those who would save their life will lose it, and those who will lose their life for my sake will find it. And it's like, what? That doesn't make any sense either. And then he talks about, if those who would come after me take up their cross and follow me. Well, who takes up their cross? Let's go back to that. And that's a little specific thing to think about. The one who carries their cross at that time was one who was condemned to death, condemned to crucifixion. Not only were you going to go be killed in this horribly brutal, long fashion, you had to carry your own cross to do it. So it is the condemned who will follow Jesus. And again, here's that paradox. And now when I think about that, I think about it through the lens of Lutheran theology, what we call theology of the cross, that we call a thing what it is, that we can see the cross now and see it as a thing of joy, see it as a thing of victory, see it as a thing of glory. But it's only because of what has already been accomplished. And yet we recognize our own brokenness. We recognize the brokenness of the world, and we call it what it is. And yet we also trust and profess that we have a God who can and does create new life out of death, who creates something new out of the cross. I've heard it said that Jesus, the act of God through Jesus in the world was so radical, and it is, that the powers that be battle against it, and those who hold the power of this world tried everything they could to stop it, and for them that's death, and that's probably what Peter's thinking, that death ends it. So they put him to death, so he dies an enemy of the state, he dies an enemy of the religious powers, so the cross is the world's way of saying no to God. The resurrection is God's way of saying yes anyway. that the no of the world is insufficient to stand against the yes of God. And I've been thinking all about that, and I'm going to make just a quick note. I'm getting kind of long-winded here, but backing up a little bit to what Jesus says to Peter when he says, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not stand against it. The gates of Hades, remember, Hades is the place where dead people go. So don't necessarily think hell. We usually tend to think hell, but when hell is intended, that's a different Greek word. It's Gehenna. Hades is the place where dead people are. So the land of the dead, whatever, death the gates of it will not hold up. Now, whenever I've thought about that, I've always thought that means that the powers of death, the powers of hell, the powers of Satan, whatever you want to say, are attacking the church. And I think it's the other way around. That the church, the gospel, Jesus, God, all together, all of this is invading the land of the dead, the realm of the dead, the place where dead people are. Because the gate is intended to either keep people in or to keep people out. That's what a gate does. But the gate will not prevail. The gate will not hold up to the assault that God's putting on it. And someone read this to me this week as I was talking with some other pastors, and I really liked it. That God is laying an invasion on enemy territory, on land held by the devil. Grace is invading death. God is invading death. Jesus is invading death. How? Through his own, through the cross, through his death, and then his resurrection. That the grace of God is invading territory held by the enemy. And the powers of death, the gates of death, won't stand up to that. We see that in some of the different stories of Jesus raising people from the dead. We see that there's power over death. We see that in his own resurrection, that where the world says no, God says yes, and God's yes is bigger, is better, is stronger. So that's kind of where I'm going with this sermon. I still got some more noodling around to do with it, but it's an exciting thing. It's very, it's kind of spiritual warfare almost type stuff that I'm going to talk about, or that potentially I can talk about, that what sounds about. But if you have thoughts, questions, comments, throw them down in the comment section. We'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we will catch you next time.